Good afternoon and welcome to SHM's Practice Management Webinar Series. This series brings together experts from across the country to cover the most pressing operational topics related to the COVID-19 pandemic. We encourage attendees to join today's discussion by submitting questions to our panelists via the question box on your control panel. For best audio quality, please call into the webinar by phone and link directly to your computer. Your microphones have been muted, so please use the chat feature to communicate with us directly if you are experiencing any technical difficulties. This live webinar and other COVID resources have been made freely accessible to the public on our website. Resources such as these are only made possible through member dollars. If you find today's webinar valuable, we kindly ask you to consider joining SHM to ensure continual access to the content that you need most. CME credit for this webinar has been made exclusively available to SHM members through our online learning portal. Today, we are pleased to feature a panel of 3 hospitalists from around the country who are leaders at their respective residency training programs. From Campbell University in North Carolina, we welcome Dr. Srinivas Vuppala. From Virginia Mason in Washington, we welcome Dr. Brandee Grooms. And from Yale University in Connecticut, we welcome Dr. Christopher Sankey. Each panelist will offer a behind-the-scenes look at what their programs have done to adapt to COVID-19 and share any tips, challenges, and best practices they have learned along the way. We will conclude with a dedicated time for Q&A with our panelists, but please feel free to submit any questions at any time throughout the presentation. Without further ado, I will now turn things over to our first presenter. Please welcome Dr. Srinivas Vuppala from Campbell University.
Great, thank you. I just want to make sure my audio is still good, and my computer is telling me it is. So thank you guys for joining us, and very apropos that we're doing this as a webinar when we're talking about trying to teach our young learners online and in many different ways other than our traditional bedside rounds. So I am a former associate program director down in New Orleans for a few years, and then I led a hospitalist group for a few years, and so got some experience on trying to innovate and build up a new group. And currently I'm the clerkship director for hospital medicine for Campbell University at a small campus called Conway Medical Center. And we're about to start up our transitional year program as well. So things are really changing, and we're having to change with it. Next. So the world has changed a lot in the last 6 months. The world's a very different place than it was a year ago. For our own personal experience, our third-year students, who happen to be our first third-year class at Conway Medical Center, they went virtual in February of 2020 when things hit. So there was virtual learning put in quickly by Campbell University itself. A lot of you that have kids have experience with kids trying to do online learning and know the hurdles that we had when that first started. So the same thing was very true for the medical school. They tried EKG reviews, live and recorded lectures, but all of it was lacking. It's zero patient contact, and so how do you simulate that online was the big challenge. At that point in the year, we really had no idea what the future held for us as far as how long the students and the interns would be out. We didn't know what kind of precautions or how many people were going to be out after they started back on the wards, and so we really just had to be very innovative. So this was especially frustrating for our third-year students because these are core clerkships, and there's been many a paper written on the importance of core clerkships and future development for these young learners. And so we had to try to simulate things best we could. So just imagine, being on your surgical rotation, never setting foot in the operating room and trying to learn surgery. Our internal medicine doctors the same way. Teaching bedside rounds over the internet was a big challenge. Next. So what's a teacher to do? And I'll tell you, it was a lot of innovation and really nothing based on previous data and some based on previous experience, but a lot of it based on just common sense and trial and error. but it really wasn't rocket science. It really, the thing that fueled our success at our facility was enthusiasm and patience, and what works for one place may not actually work for another. So just bear that in mind when you are trying to set up anything in your own institution. Next. So there's a couple of challenges and some solutions that we came up with. Again, trial and error was a big part of this. So old school was phone conferences. And if any of you have seen that Geico commercial or ever been on a phone conference, as soon as one person talks, another one tries to talk, and nobody can hear either of them. And so that was something that was really thrown out the window. We didn't even attempt that. But new school, there's a lot of online platforms, GoToMeeting like we're using right now, WebEx, Zoom, all of those things, all of those platforms were incredibly useful trying to navigate this new method of learning. So Zoom was what we actually preferred to use just because it was available through our parent company, Team Health. So we did use that. So a couple of tips I have about any platform that you use, whether it's GoToMeeting, WebEx, or whether it's Zoom. The thing that probably helped us the most was a dry run. So I recruited about 3 or 4 students, and we did a dry run to see what kind of connectivity issues we had, video issues they had, audio issues. We found a lot. But by the time we actually did our first formal session, doing that dry run with those students for about an hour, we ironed out almost all those issues, especially with them receiving the Zoom invite or audio issues that they were having, what they had to download, and it really made for a much smoother session that first time. The other thing that I would strongly encourage you to use, a lot of these platforms have a recording feature, and for those students or those interns that can't actually make that webinar or that teaching session, that recording feature was invaluable, and they were able to catch up later that night or just down the road, or even if it was a lot of content and they wanted to just review it, we had those indexed so that they could access those again. Now, certainly some of that may be attached to a subscription fee, etc. So you may have to just get creative talking to your facility. The last thing I want to mention to everybody is nothing ruins a webinar session like background noise. So mute. Just make sure that you know the features of being able to mute everybody, or that you remind constantly for people to mute so there's not a lot of background noise and everybody can get the most out of their session. And lastly, that it's been in the news, multiple horror stories about hackers that get in to the Zoom session, and so make sure that you are using the password protect feature. It's just another layer of security. It's another step for people to sign on, and just complicates things a little bit. But the last thing you want is somebody signing into your Zoom session and causing havoc. Next. So our next challenge was content. So how are we going to simulate bedside rounds or teaching on the wards, or just even classroom teaching when we're all together, where there's a lot of times more participation. So with such short notice, putting together meaningful lectures, that can be a challenge. So we recruited those people that we thought who would be most involved and enthusiastic. So you need at least a small group of core people, maybe 2 or 3 people that would do a good portion of the lectures, and then trying to bring in your subspecialists or other specialties once you had all the technical issues ironed out. So I know that some people have access to products like question banks and flashcards, and every student, every program has their own resources. Take advantage of those, and you can easily broadcast those by sharing the screen like we're doing now. So, for example, med study was one that I used a fair bit, and as you can see, there's a screenshot there of one of the questions, and we would simply go through question by question or flashcard by flashcard to allow everybody to participate. We would take turns, put people on the spot, or we would just let people write in the question box to see if they knew the answer before we would go over the answer itself. So screen sharing. So learn how to use that. It makes for a much more effective session. If you're not using that, you might as well do a phone conference. Next. So another challenge was variety and stimulation. So you can only do so many questions, you can only do so many flashcards before people are not interested in signing on anymore. So just make sure that you alternate the content types. lectures, our traditional way of teaching, are much more passive than, say, questions and modules may be. My favorite was what I call choose your own adventure patient scenarios. So, for example, you can use upper GI bleed, you could use acute pancreatitis, you could use acute stroke, acute MI, but it was simply running through a script that you had thought about before, just your own experience taking care of patients. The upper GI bleed one is especially effective. Propose to them that a 35-year-old male comes into the ER and possibly with a history of alcoholism, and just go through step by step what they should be doing, from inserting large bore IVs all the way to when the patient starts crashing, what kind of response do they need to have. And the students, the feedback that I got from students was that they loved those sessions more than anything else. It stuck with them, and it really challenged them as far as how do you really take care of the patient at the bedside. Make sure you leave time for and encourage questions, or for people to share their experiences. It doesn't always have to just be a question and answer session. Even a question as simple as, have any of you all seen an acute pancreatitis patient? What may you have learned from that? And nothing simulates bedside care like the real thing, but like I mentioned, case-based questions and modules are more practical, they're more stimulating, and they're better probably than lecturing concepts alone. Next. So there was a picture there that it didn't show up, but that's okay. But I just wanted to mention some unique approaches that other places are taking. COVID is with us, and it's going to be around for quite some time. Hopefully a year from now, we're talking about an effective vaccine and in very few cases, but it's always going to be in our differential diagnosis for a lot of things. So how do we get around the fact that we may not have student or intern or resident presence on the floor all the time? So there is a college in London, Imperial College, that actually has virtual reality rounds. The attending physician has a cool set of glasses, and when they're looking through those glasses, they can see on the screen on one side is the actual patient, the other side is they can put up the radiographs or the EKG or the computer screen with all their patient data or whatnot. And those kind of technologies are really going to flourish, I think, in this new wave of teaching. The other thing is open book online exams, where they shuffle the questions for each student, and you can simply have software that'll do that, so that again, you don't have to gather everybody, but that you can effectively get those exams done in a timely manner. And then lastly, we have our stethoscopes that record sounds, and it really wasn't a big leap to try to transmit those clinical sounds via the speaker online, and so those can absolutely be effective sessions. As you guys can tell from this broadcast, the sound quality nowadays is very, very good, and so it's a great way to teach lung sounds, heart sounds, bowel sounds, all those things. So I'll leave you with this: whilst disruptive, this pandemic may serve to expose institutions to novel means of teaching and assessment, which may ultimately improve medical education in the future. And that was a quote from the Journal of Medical Education and Curricular Development. I think that as we go forward, as physicians and in healthcare, we've always had to innovate. I don't see that with a little bit of energy. I don't think that we are going to take too much away from medical education. I think that we're only going to enhance it going forward. Next. And I'll hand things over to Dr. Brandee Grooms.
Thanks, Srinivas. So I'm Brandee Grooms, Program Director of the Internal Medicine Residency Program at Virginia Mason, and hospitalist here as well. So we're a community-based program right in the heart of Seattle, and we host medical students from the University of Washington as well. Next slide. So I completed my first year of program directorship back in January of 2020, and I thought, all right, so now I've got 1 year under my belt and I know what to expect, and everything from this point on is going to be a cakewalk. And then we entered into the unknown in February, when we heard word that our neighbors in Kirkland were experiencing some of the first cases. And so we ventured into that unknown, not knowing what the rest of this graph was going to look like in the coming weeks and months. And so some of that just involved, planning for any eventuality. Next slide. So, immediately we think about what are our concerns and how do they maybe compete with each other. So guiding principles have been really important every step of the way, and kind of keeping those at the forefront, and talking about what we're sacrificing for what, or what's able to support what. So patients and their access to care and how we're able to continue to provide access to care. The safety of everyone, our patients, our residents, our faculty, maintaining education, maintaining our workforce, and how to find balance with all of these things. So, then the next step is kind of all the questions, right? So the technical aspects of our access to PPE, how many people are going to go in that room? Is it going to be a student and an intern and a resident and an attending? Or do we really need to change how we're structuring our teams or structuring who goes into the room? Thinking about our vulnerable residents, how do we identify them? Thinking about their safety, but also thinking about their confidentiality. How do we support them? Thinking about our vulnerable patients. So what clinics can we keep open, and how do we ensure that our most vulnerable population has good access to care? Information overload. So as soon as we knew that COVID was in our community, our command center opened up. So this was, really helpful for generating a lot of information quickly. But as I'm sure many of you have experienced, the sheer, volume of emails of policy updates, information about the virus, information about its treatment, quickly became really overwhelming. And it was important to think about what information do we need to condense down to, both for this scope of time and this scope of care. So, what is important today, what's important for the rest of this week, and how are we going to ensure that that stream of information is open and continuous, but not overwhelming. Thinking about our students became more and more challenging over time, and ultimately the university pulled them all off of their clinical rotations, and that decision was kind of made for us. But up until that time, it was really trying to find and navigate the safest places to place them, to keep their education going, and to ensure that they felt supported. And then what does it look like bringing them back onto campus, which we got to do a few blocks later. And thankfully, by that point in time, we were a lot more facile in our processes and what was happening with the trend of cases. And so that allowed us to really be planful. Workspaces continues to be a real big challenge. So in the beginning, it was really a matter of where can we appropriately space ourselves for work, for eating, and for didactic. And then we got into, a really nice place during the summer, and just this last week, we're revisiting this conversation again. So identifying creatively the spaces within the hospital, outside of the hospital, within our clinics, where residents can go to both take off their mask and eat, as well as engage in our didactics. And didactics. So we were fortunate enough that we were already utilizing Microsoft Teams as a program. We had not been using them for didactic. We were a small enough program that we could just have everybody come in and be in person. But fortunately, because we had been using Microsoft Teams for other features of it, we just rapidly transitioned into that format and have gone with that since. Helping, our lecturers, our residents, our students utilize the platform to the best of its ability has been a constant learning curve, and it's been really important that we're touching base, multiple times along the way. We switched over and that worked, but you can't just let that be, going back and refining, thinking about the ways in which people are interacting differently with the material, thinking about ways in which we can utilize resources that weren't available to us before, like, our recent graduates who are now in fellowship, reaching out to us and saying, hey, I could give a lecture now from where I'm at. And so those were new opportunities that we welcomed. And ultimately, we did get to a place where we really needed to pull some of our residents off of rotations, either because of lack of stable PPE or lack of patients. So some of our oncology clinics, some of our geriatric experiences going into SNFs, just, that opportunity wasn't there. So we either needed to retool the rotation a bit or have them do home study until we could, ensure that they had a stable work environment to come into. Next slide. Thinking about backup plans for backup plans. So, I think whenever a system is stressed, the strengths and the weaknesses of that system come out, and so does the culture of the system that you're working in. So fortunately, as a smaller hospital, a community-based program, and an organization that's invested deeply in the Virginia Mason production system, which is the system by which we improve the quality of our system of care. We've built over a long period of time this culture of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work, of being nimble and being willing to try new things. And so that allowed us to pivot really rapidly as we were going through the process of figuring out how to keep our residents engaged and participating in patient care and learning, while all of the aspects of how we delivered that care were changing. It was also really helpful, and I think this is where the section of hospital medicine leadership is at its strongest, because it was really helpful for us to think of ourselves as not just one section or siloed groups that are having to navigate alone, but to really create a continuum of hospital service care from the ER to the CCU to the wards, and GME needed to be a really important part of that as well. I appreciate my colleagues leading by example. So this was an all-in approach, and it continues to be an all-in approach. All of our hospitalist leaders, our ER department, our CCU, our APPs, and our primary care doctors, as well as our specialists, have been willing to come to the table and look at ways in which they could support a surge in inpatient need. So that allowed me to message really clearly to our residents that whatever I ask you to do, I am going there as well, and so are all my colleagues. You will always have support. We will always be communicating to each other, and we all have a role to play, whether it's direct patient care with COVID patients or it's direct patient care with non-COVID patients to free up those who are going to be taking care of COVID patients, whether it's cross-cover from home, whether it's telemedicine, whether it's leading a study group. There are ways to contribute beyond just being able to be in that COVID room. And much of that in the beginning we didn't need to use, fortunately, because if you go to the next slide, please. Fortunately in our region, our local leadership, and I have to thank my fellow Washingtonians, who masked up and socially distanced and really changed the curve. And so, like I mentioned before, our summer actually became a really stable time. Still challenging, still difficult, but a little more stable than what we were expecting, and that really huge spike that we feared never came to fruition. This graph has changed since I last pulled it off of our Department of Health website. So that gray area is actually a sharp curve upward, which is what we're experiencing throughout the country. So those plans that we laid way back in February, March, weren't for waste. We'll be dusting those off, looking at them again, and seeing what portions of those we'll need to implement, because we are anticipating the possibility of a surge, as I think we all expected going into winter, and we may be needing to utilize parts of that plan that we didn't have to in the first go around. Next slide. So, as always, tight communication with hospital medicine leadership and GME remains critical. The fact that our leadership is willing to and enjoys collaborating with us on a tight level. The fact that our huddles in hospital medicine have been made available to the residents who are in wards, so they can join in and hear what problems are being tackled, what policies are being adjusted, and they have a voice. Thinking about the frequency again, we're back into that place where the frequency of communication needs to be more on a weekly or sometimes more often basis, where information from a variety of sources can be condensed and clearly delivered to our residents. Here's what you need to know this week, what you need to know this month. That kind of communication is becoming really critical again. We had just not too long ago moved our didactics to a hybrid of in-person and through Teams, because we found that our lecturers really struggled to talk into what felt like a void. This is where, whenever possible, having your video on really matters for that level of engagement with the residents. However, we're back in a place as of last week where our governor has announced, again, we've got these restrictions on gathering. That means that we're all virtual once again. So that's where our chief residents really have an important role in maintaining engagement. We're reaching out and ensuring that our residents both are engaged with the program and the work that they're doing. They understand where things stand, that their questions are being answered, that their fears are being addressed, is really, really important. And with us being a community-based program, a lot of our residents are here because they want that sense of community. And that was incredibly important when we welcomed in our intern class and got them onboarded and oriented, how to get them connected, how to create community when there's so many limitations that we hadn't had to experience before. And so I can't, overemphasize the importance of connecting as often as possible with your learners. Including not only, how are they experiencing residency, but, what's going on in their lives, how are their families navigating this, their loved ones, what are their biggest fears and hopes during this time. It's interesting because Instagram wasn't something that our program had really leaned into until recently, and I found that they have really found a way to utilize our program's Instagram account to connect not only with each other, but with others within the hospital and the clinics and within our community. So they've been, generating a lot of gratitude and connectivity between some of the smaller local businesses that are struggling as well, between Bloodworks Northwest. A lot of different community connections have been forged. And I think it's helped us greatly during our recruitment season as well to kind of, show that we're still here and we're still connected. Next slide. So, guiding principles for, what I would say a pandemic, but really for life. I didn't have many years of experience in this position to lean on, but what I did have is many years as a hospitalist to lean on. And so many of the skills that you are using every day as a hospitalist are the same skills that we can use to navigate, what may be a really heterogeneous experience for all of us. But I think the things that are, in common in all of these situations is that there is a great degree of uncertainty. There are problems to solve. Change is part of the steady state. And so rapid adaptation, the ability to triage, thinking about quality and safety, how we communicate across teams and multiple disciplines, knowing and trusting your team, managing uncertainty and demonstrating how to navigate uncertainty, having those tough conversations, staying true to your mission, and realigning yourself with your mission over and over again as you go, snatching up all those opportunities to innovate, identifying the silver linings in the whole process, and staying connected to our purpose in medicine and our compassion, all really critical during this time, always important, more so now than ever. Fortunately, we've all had training in this realm of hospital medicine that really gives us those skills and abilities to navigate all of this as well. All right, next slide. I'm pleased to hand over to Dr. Christopher Sankey.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Chris. I am the Associate Program Director for one of Yale's internal medicine residency programs. I also am the interim director of our academic hospitalist group. I think in contrast, we are a really large tertiary center program. So we have 140 total residents. And while New Haven did not see the COVID volume that New York City did, it was still substantial. The peak inpatient COVID volume at our institution was about 450 inpatients, and we had 100 to 120 of those patients in ICUs. And that we reached that in mid to late April. So large program, fairly substantial number of cases, and so a lot of really important changes that we had to make in response. So our technical platform here is Zoom, and so we immediately went completely virtual with our didactic sessions, which in our program, every day we have both a morning report, which is a case-based discussion facilitated by one or two of our chief residents, noon conferences, which tend to be more didactic as part of a year-long curriculum. And we immediately switched those from in-person to virtual. And we have more than one campus that we send our trainees to. We have a VA campus, we have a main campus, and then we have an additional smaller private hospital campus within the same city. So all of these conferences were broadcast simultaneously via Zoom to learners in all three campuses. And I think as mentioned earlier, we early on realized that using the record function available in Zoom was going to be essential. So we started recording our educational sessions, and we archived them and made them available for residents in ICU rotations or night rotations, or for any number of reasons who couldn't attend the sessions live. And I think we were no different. Our students were removed from the wards, but I think a unique challenge for our program, in addition to size, was the fact that for a number of reasons, our residents were actually, as opposed to being removed from the wards, clinics were completely shut down, and our residents were specifically tasked to ICU and COVID teams because we had such an overwhelming need for ICU and step down level care. So that's really where we focused our residents, and our chiefs came up with what they called a pod structure, where a group of residents were on kind of 8-day rotations, where they spent 4 days on the COVID unit or in the ICU, and then 2 days providing at-home virtual support, order entry, family calling, etc., and then 2 days off. And one of the things, as we both look backward at what our trainees' educational experience was during the first wave of COVID, and as we then plan as to how we're going to continue and maintain education as we're facing a second wave. As we speak right now, our inpatient census in our hospital is back up almost to 200, so certainly not the 450 that we were at previously, but a month ago we were in the low 20s, I believe. So the cases are definitely on the rise, and so it's really been very, very helpful and important to obtain internal data. So one of my main functions as associate program director is I oversee inpatient education and the inpatient experience for our learners. And as part of that, I do an annual educational survey, and I ask residents questions about their opinions on noon conference and morning report and ward-based education, like how's the learning climate? Are you having goals established? Do you get clinical coaching, etc.? And the results of that survey get turned into a kind of an annual educational report. What you're looking at right now on the screen is just the cover from that. But having some pre-COVID data made the information that we got about COVID time education, I think really, really important. So, for example, in this educational survey that we gave our residents, there were summative questions about really specifically about pre-COVID and post-COVID. So you can see here on the left, was the pre-COVID inpatient experience sufficient to meet your educational needs? Yes, no, not sure. And you can see here, generally speaking, most of our learners really found the inpatient education to meet their needs. Post-COVID, there's the same sort of general pattern of more residents feeling that it was sufficient versus insufficient, although there was a little bit more insufficiency here. So the question is, what is driving this increase in learners who felt that during COVID education was insufficient? And without taking the time to go through it now, the pre and post COVID perceptions of both morning report and noon conference were no different. In spite of the fact that it went from in-person to virtual, ultimately the overall experience was judged similarly. And so what it really left us to surmise here is that the difference in the overall educational experience was likely the inpatient ward education. And some of the really, I think, important and helpful comments that we got from the narrative part of the survey, I think gave us some really interesting bits of information that we are absolutely trying to operationalize as we, again, try and adapt education to the coming second wave. So, we were really concerned as to learner perception of these interactive conferences by Zoom versus in person. We were really surprised and relieved to hear that we got multiple comments noting how Zoom was in many ways an improvement. We've, even before COVID, had issues with conference access just because a lot of our clinical rotations are so busy and we have different sites and different rotations and residents rotating in the CCU, for example, or on our hematology service, et cetera, don't typically have the time to go to a different tower and go to an inpatient and in-person conference, but Zoom allowed us to do that. So it really helped us address an access issue. So kind of like we heard before, virtual teaching certainly provides and affords some opportunities as opposed to simply barriers. Very interesting and again, totally unanticipated. We got some learners who actually believed that learning climate was better on Zoom because they felt maybe less on the spot than maybe they did during in-person conferences, which was also interesting. To speak to the why we think maybe more learners felt like COVID era education was insufficient, I think this third bullet from the narrative comments really sums it up importantly. It was really felt that inpatient education was really effectively ground to a halt during COVID. All the educational efforts really seemed to be focused on COVID. To their credit, our chief residents did a really fantastic job. They started a Slack channel, which was a technical medium I had not been familiar with at all previous to that, and it really was helpful in allowing our, for us as a big program, everybody to really be able to digest and categorize a lot of the avalanche of information about PPE and testing options, updated clinical algorithms, et cetera. But that really was the main focus. And so even on non-COVID services, taking care of non-COVID patients, our learners really felt like education stopped there too, where even when you weren't directly caring for COVID patients, the overall mindset was still one that was COVID focused and COVID centric. And I thought that's, again, really important information as we go forward. And certainly our learners gave us a strong desire to continue education on non-COVID topics. As we all know, you know, heart failure and diabetes and vasculitis and kidney injury, et cetera, obviously didn't go away in spite of the fact that COVID cases were surging. So anyway, this information, and this is my last slide, and I'll be happy to open things to questions here shortly. You know, the thoughts that these data really allowed us to consider locally here at my institution was the extent to which education, and I pose these questions, and by no means do I have sort of perfect answers for all of them, but I think important points for us to consider, and maybe if appropriate to your specific institutions and environments, maybe these will be important for or helpful for you to consider as well. The extent to which education sort of either enhances or detracts from wellness and well-being. Obviously, probably to a certain extent, yes. Probably to the nth degree, maybe not. What steps can be taken to maintain ward-based education in the event of another surge? We are, you know, on the cusp of an additional surge here, and we are really making concerted, proactive efforts to non-COVID floors and attendings on non-COVID floors to maintain the standard operating procedures in terms of attending rounds and goal setting and feedback and learning climate, et cetera. But we're trying to be more explicit and intentional about it. And obviously how we maintain broad-based education, we're being, again, intentional about maintaining a curriculum in our noon conference lecture series and not necessarily going back to COVID-focused case-based learning. So those are some of the things that we've been grappling with here, and with that, that concludes the didactic, if you will, portion of the webinar. And now we're very interested to solicit questions from all of you, and you know, we're happy to try and answer as best we can on the basis of our experiences at our local centers, which you've heard a little bit about. So I'm gonna just try and pull up a couple of questions. We have 2 so far. Let's see. So the first question here is, in terms of virtual education platforms, are trainees engaged or just there for attendance? And I think this is something that I think a lot of us have struggled with, and specifically, is the video on or is the video off? You know, I'm happy to hear Brandee and Srinivas kind of give your experience. I can say that we've really had probably an assortment where there are some trainees who are absolutely unplugged from Epic and order entry and note writing, and are sitting in front of the Zoom screen and actively engaged either verbally or with the chat. And there are some who don't have the video on, and the you know, iPhone is in the corner, and you can sort of hear the voices in the background, but it's really just business as usual. So I don't know, Srinivas, Brandee, what are your experiences with trainee engagement?
Yeah, we've had that same question come up multiple times, you know, especially if you have a workroom of residents and they're utilizing one computer, one screen, one microphone. And so it's been helpful for them to put into the chat or to unmute and say, you know, who's attending on this particular log on. and that's where screens on really has been important, and kind of monitoring who's interacting either verbally or in the chat and who's not. But it is tough.
It sometimes can take a little bit more organizing and maybe not appropriate for the first session that you try, but one of the sessions we did later on, we assigned topics to several of the people we knew that would be attending. Sorry for the phone in the background. And so they took ownership, and so they had to actually present themselves, and people were more attuned to listening to their fellow interns and students rather than just one speaker the entire time. So providing some variety might provide a little bit more engagement as well, and really put people on the spot a little bit.
Great, thanks. The next question, are there any changes that you've made during the pandemic that you feel will be permanent even post-COVID? For example, do you see didactic sessions remaining virtual?
Yeah, I think we've talked to, informally polled our residents, and there are a lot of really positive aspects of being able to attend virtually, especially for those who are at satellite clinics off campus, or would normally not be able to attend. I think another kind of silver lining that we don't want to let go of is access and training in telemedicine, which was a huge door that opened for us, and I think prepares our residents for their future careers. So, being able to access lecturers who may not be on site but could give lectures from home has been a bonus for them, the lecturers and our residents. So yeah, there's definitely parts that we don't want to let go of, but there is a benefit to in-person interaction and engagement that we look forward to getting back.
So ours is a relatively young program, so I think that there's certain components that you just really can't do without that are very traditional. For example, I think morning report is a great opportunity to really challenge people as far as differential diagnosis and thinking that early in the morning, versus a lot of the other things that we do. For example, the recorded sessions and allowing people to watch it on at their own convenience. That will definitely stay. And I know that the feedback that we have gotten is having that library of talks has really allowed people not to try to juggle 7 things at a time when they're in the hospital, and engage a little bit more when they're watching it after hours. So we're certainly going to have that bank of lectures to use.
And I can certainly second that. Our learners in the survey were really very emphatic, because we asked the question specifically, whenever we're fortunate enough to be able to put COVID in the rearview mirror, would you like the Zoom option to remain? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. And so I think I envision us settling into kind of a hybrid model, if you will, for a lot of us with kids in school. I guess what I mean by hybrid would be to go back to in-person didactic sessions, report and noon conference, but also simultaneously have the Zoom option there, both for access for off-site learners, but also for the ability to record, because giving learners access who aren't able to attend live, I think it is really a huge benefit. And the other thing that we also have started to discuss is, we've always been looking for ways to try and enhance education for our trainees on night rotations. And so we're even thinking of being able to, once we accumulate a big enough cache of these recorded sessions, maybe even curate them as appropriate to overnight rotations in, say, oncology or hematology or infectious disease. And we have a good number of specialty services at our institution. And for those of you who do, you could consider something similar. So yes, we definitely will keep that going forward.
And then I'll just add one thing is that for those that are in program leadership or are the ones that are always having to argue for funding for this, that, and the other. One of the things that we used temporarily was that we have a CME allowance. And so usually at the end of the year, we're struggling to figure out who has the best Apple gift card. But instead, we got programs we thought would be effective that we could share and use. And so certainly use our resources for that and work on a good game plan to pitch to administration or whoever handles your funding about the huge advantages to having those resources available to you.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. So we've been talking a lot, obviously, about virtual learning. I guess through that medium, how can educators engage the learners? Things like Poll Everywhere and like Zoom as a platform has some polling capacity, et cetera. And my thought on that is, the ability to teach via this medium, while sort of obviously a new skill for all of us, is really an important skill for us to identify as being necessary and worthy of specific just-in-time, actionable, behavioral-based feedback, right? The same way that we would provide feedback for a learner at the bedside in terms of how to auscultate an aortic stenosis murmur, really trying to coach chief residents, faculty, other residents who are participating in these virtual sessions and moderating these sessions is really important. For example, our chief residents have gotten really, really good at simultaneously basically using the whiteboard function on Zoom such that you can maintain a bit of a chalk talk feel, but at the same time monitoring the chat and responding to that, throwing questions out to the group, but also simultaneously actually monitoring who the participants are and maybe even calling on some participants to make sure that it's not just a unattended phone in the middle of a workroom with everybody writing their notes. So it's not uncommon for our chief residents to say, 5-5 workroom, what do you think? So regardless of how you do it, I think as educators and educational leaders, it's actually a very important skill in this current era to really help our colleagues and our trainees develop how to moderate these virtual sessions.
Yeah, I would echo everything you just said, Chris. I think our chiefs have become the most skilled in recognizing how to moderate a conference, help the lecturer interface with the various audiences, whether we're in a hybrid state or completely virtual, because our lecturers cycle through frequently enough. Those touch points are for them to be the center of knowledge is really tough. And, I think over the course of a year, hopefully we won't have to go into a second year, but, they'll gain the skill over time. But it's that just-in-time sort of knowledge that allows that, having that second person in the room who's really moderating it and monitoring the chat and helping to engage the audience. That's incredibly important. We've been utilizing our section liaisons to kind of filter the feedback to our lecturers to kind of put on their radar, okay, here's how we're now conducting our didactics. We created some bullet points of kind of best practices that have been curated from the feedback of the residents and the chiefs. And kind of highlighted some of our lecturers who have really stood out in their ability to utilize the platform to the kind of the highest level of its capability. And then our residents are, you know, for those who aren't as comfortable setting up a poll or making it a more interactive sort of experience, our residents have been kind of curating learning points through the week and running an end of week Jeopardy. So just kind of keeping that engagement, trying to make it a little bit fun as well, which I think has been really helpful to everybody.
And I'll add, and those are great points, and in fact, things that I'm probably going to take back to our program and integrate. But you know, we're talking about the learners here, but we found that there was 2 speakers at our facility who I sold them on the fact that they could record their Zoom session and we could play it later. And these are people that have an intense fear of public speaking, really, you know, but they're very, very smart and very good educators when they want to be. And so trying to find those people and taking advantage of the fact that you can record that, or some people just feel more comfortable sitting in front of the computer with the PowerPoint slides showing, but really want to teach. If you can find those people to get involved, you may have yet another source for teachers.
And wonderful, thank you. One other thing that just actually jogged my memory, our chief residents recently have started doing what they're calling morning report on repeat, which as a sort of a way to engage and again try and consolidate some of the learning, is at the end of a given week they'll send out an email, and they do it through MailChimp, so it's like it's very visually kind of pleasing, but they basically just summarize the key clinical points that were the subject of the reports for that given week. So for learners who had been present for them, it would hopefully reinforce, and for learners who had not had the opportunity, at least it's some way to access the content. There is a question about well-being. You know, basically our you know, our residents haven't necessarily been interacting with too many COVID patients, but are still feeling burnt out and unwell, and now again, as cases rise and care of COVID patients may be on the table, what wisdom can we as a panel provide to help enhance residents' well-being? But that's a really challenging question, and I think well-being is probably deserving of its own separate webinar. I'll only briefly state that you know, well-being in our program is something that we are monitoring regularly, and it's something that we are also struggling with. You know, we try very hard to maintain clear and consistent communication to the extent that it is possible in this kind of avalanche of inputs that we often get. You know, we try and serve. Resident safety is our top priority, and so we make issues like PPE availability a top concern. As appropriate to sort of this discussion here, maintaining education and maintaining a broad education, you know, I happen to believe that that is something that can contribute to wellness, and as opposed to, you know, sap bandwidth, although others may disagree. But I wish there was a simple way to improve it. You know, wellness is such a kind of a complex issue, and it's one that's really hard, obviously, to maintain in the face of a global pandemic.
Yeah, I would echo the complexity of understanding where the burnout is coming from. I think is really important. Is this burnout, or is this under recovery? I think that's a really helpful distinction to determine you know, our residents in a state where they need a plan for recovering in sleep, recovering emotionally, recovering kind of mentally or debriefing. And if given a pathway, they can kind of get their feet back up underneath them, but they haven't lost, you know, a connection to why they're there, or, you know, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? What does that look like? Some of it's, and then if it's not under recovery, but it's true burnout, you know, what resources do we have to address the sources of burnout, to identify them, and to support that individual or that group. And then, you know, thinking about that, you know, our residents aren't, you know, just experiencing life in the hospital, but, you know, having that ability to ask, you know, what else is going on in their lives, because life continues, you know, with or without residency. And so, you know, do they have support for all the other aspects of life? And life has gotten very complicated for everyone, and so, you know, it should be no different, you know, for their loved ones. So yeah, just I think it's trying to tune into what is the actual state that our residents are in, and do we have pathways to reconnect them.
And you know, using these same platforms that we're talking about for education, using them for fun stuff. I was talking to a student recently that instead of going to a pre-interview dinner, they did a pre-interview Zoom gathering. So everybody was at home and they were had their drink of choice in hand and just relaxed and asking questions about the program. But even on a once a month or once every couple of weeks basis, allowing the students to have a slot of time, or the residents to have a slot of time just to unwind, just talk to each other, see each other, people that they haven't seen for some time, and realize that they're not alone in all this.
Great. All right, we're right about a little after 4, and so the final question that I have in the question box here is about rounding models, which is, I think, an excellent question, and probably one that is answered differently depending on the specific environments. I'm curious about rounding models in your programs. Did they stay table only? Any in-person rounding occurring? And so I can tell you that during the height of the COVID peak at our institution, in order to preserve PPE, we really tried to limit the amount of in-person in-room visits. So all of our consulting services went virtual. So they were not seeing patients directly. They were either doing chart review electronically or speaking with patients virtually via an iPad. And for the primary team members, usually either the intern would go in and usually the intern would go in the morning, and then sometime before the end of the day, the attending would go in. But the traditional rounds where the entirety of the team shuffled into the room certainly didn't occur. And the bedside rounding, which we like to do quite often, where we actually have the entirety of the discussion in the room with the team and the patient, also wasn't happening. And so that's what we've done here at Yale.
We've fluctuated through a few different models. So we have unit-based teams, which means that many of our units aren't seeing COVID or respiratory patients, and so they can kind of continue business as usual. But those teams that are seeing COVID patients or respiratory patients, you know, through the last several months, some of the decision making is based on the availability of PPE and trying to be good stewards of that. And so we've, you know, had our teams kind of negotiate, okay, who on the team actually goes bedside? Do we, you know, implement some form of telemedicine to support that process? And I think we'll be looking at that again going into end of November and December. But you know, for up to this point, we just try to support each team making a decision based on what their panel of patients is looking like, what the PPE situation is looking like, And we've given them, we tried to encourage, leadership from the senior resident and the attending to, empower them to troubleshoot in the moment what makes the most sense for this team with this panel under these circumstances, and then be there for support to navigate the tougher decision making, or if it seems like something's not working quite right, to come in and provide some guidance.
Yeah, and I can say that we're still struggling with it, in that our third-year students cannot see COVID patients just to preserve PPE. I've told the students that this is an unfortunate time to be a student, and that they're not getting that full experience, but a very, very fortunate time to be a student, in that they are part of medical history. And so as soon as we can get those students seeing those patients that we feel safely, I certainly am advocating for that, because how else are they going to take care of the future generations of patients that come without really experiencing that hands-on?
Well,
Great.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions today. Brandee, Christopher, and Srinivas, I want to thank you for preparing such an insightful webinar. And Chris, I think you hit the mark when you said well-being is deserving of its own webinar. And as we conclude, I just wanted to invite you all to join us for a special edition of the Practice Management webinar series tomorrow, Thursday, the 19th, from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I've put the registration link in the chat box. But this webinar is titled COVID Check-in Guide, Well-Being and the Power of Interpersonal Connection. So in a time when COVID is pushing people apart and presenting new challenges for hospitalists and their well-being, SHM has developed this check-in guide to bring hospitalists together and help them understand and collectively process their experiences. On tomorrow's webinar, 2 physician members from SHM's Wellbeing Task Force will be discussing newly released data on how COVID has impacted psychological well-being. They will explain the need for honest sharing and connection, and also train participants to use the check-in guide to build mutual support within their team. We really hope that you can join us. So on behalf of all of us here at SHM, we've never been prouder to stand alongside you and in service of hospitalists. The leadership, innovation, and sacrifice you have all shown this past year has not gone unnoticed by us, and we simply want to say thank you. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation and look forward to seeing you at future installments of the Practice Management webinar series. Goodbye, everyone.